Welcome, dear reader. Before you turn this page, or rather before you read another word, I want you to know that what follows is not merely a mystery. It is something quieter than that, and in many ways, far more disturbing. We have all, at some point, stood alone in a dark room and felt it. That peculiar sensation that the silence is not quite silent. That somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, something is there. Most of us shake it off. We light a candle, we call for company, we laugh at ourselves over breakfast the next morning. But what if you couldn't shake it off? What if the whispers followed you, night after night, growing darker, more personal, more knowing? What if the very walls of your home seemed to breathe your secrets back at you? This is the story of Miss Vivian Ashworth, a young woman of fortune and fragile nerves who came to 221B Baker Street on a grey November morning believing she was losing her mind. And it is the story of how Mr. Sherlock Holmes, not immediately, not brilliantly, but slowly and humanly, began to suspect that someone very much alive was behind those shadows. If you enjoy mysteries that creep rather than crash, that unsettle before they resolve, read on. The shadows are waiting. The heiress in distress. It was, as I recall, a Tuesday, though I confess the precise date escapes me now, buried as it is beneath the weight of everything that followed. November had settled over London like a damp wool coat, grey and suffocating, and Baker Street wore it poorly. The fog that morning was the particular kind that doesn't merely obscure things, but seems to absorb them, muffling footsteps, each swallowing lamplight, reducing the world outside our sitting room window to a series of slow, uncertain shapes. I had been up since 7:30. Holmes had, to all appearances, not slept at all. He was in his chair when I came downstairs, that worn, high-backed chair, which had, over the years, absorbed so much of his brooding that I sometimes fancied it had taken on his temperament. He sat with his long legs folded beneath him in that irregular fashion of his, a cold pipe balanced between two fingers, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. There were papers scattered at his feet. A violin lay on the settee, untouched. I had learned, over our years of shared lodgings, that when Holmes left the violin untouched, it meant his mind was either perfectly empty or dangerously full. That morning, I suspected the latter. "Oh, you haven't eaten," I said, more observation than accusation. "Astute, Watson," he replied without turning his head. I poured myself some tea and settled into the chair across from him. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray, toast butter, a small pot of marmalade, and I helped myself, mostly to have something to do with my hands. The fire was low. I considered stoking it and decided against disturbing the silence. We sat like that for perhaps 20 minutes. It was, in its way, companionable. Then the bell rang. Holmes stirred, not dramatically, not with any great show of interest, but I noticed the slight lift of his chin, the almost imperceptible sharpening of his eyes. He set down the pipe. "Early for a social call," I remarked. "It is not a social call," he said simply. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs were followed by a knock, and then she opened the door with the particular expression she reserved for clients she had already formed an opinion of. Sympathetic, slightly protective. "A young lady, Mr. Holmes. She hasn't given a name, but she's—" Mrs. Hudson paused, choosing her word carefully. "Distressed." "Send her up," said Holmes. The young woman who entered our sitting room a moment later was, I would estimate, somewhere between 20 and 25 years of age, though the look about her eyes made her seem older. She was dressed well, very well in fact, the kind of quiet, understated quality that speaks not of fashion but of old money. a dark green wool coat, hair pinned neatly, gloves still on. She had made an effort, that much was clear. She had composed herself on the stairs, smoothed her coat, arranged her expression into something approaching calm. But her hands gave her away. They were clasped together at her waist so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. "Please," said Holmes, gesturing toward the settee with a languid hand. "Sit down, Miss Ashworth," she said, "Vivian Ashworth." She sat, perching rather than settling, as though she might need to stand again quickly. "I am sorry to come without an appointment. I wasn't sure I would come at all, until this morning, and then she stopped, swallowed. I apologize. I am not usually like this." "There is nothing to apologize for," I said, and meant it. Holmes said nothing. He was watching her with that expression I knew well. Not unkind exactly, but measuring, taking inventory. I sometimes wished he could soften it slightly, that look, for the sake of nervous clients. He never did. "Tell me," he said, "about the whispers." She looked up sharply. How did you know that's why I've come?" "You didn't know whether to come," Holmes said. "That suggests your trouble is not of the conventional kind. Not a theft, not a threat, not something you could walk into a police station and report. The nature of your distress is internal, or appears to be. You are well dressed, clearly of means, and yet you have come alone, without a companion or a guardian, which tells me either that you trust no one in your immediate circle or, more likely, that whatever troubles you, you fear they will not believe you." He tilted his head very slightly. "The eyes, Miss Ashworth, are often more forthcoming than the tongue. Yours suggest a person who has been lying awake in the dark, eye listening." She stared at him for a long moment. Then something in her face cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears, but with the particular exhausted relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time. "They began about 6 weeks ago," she said. "She told us everything, and I will recount it here as faithfully as I can, though I confess that even now, writing it out in the comfort of my study, there are moments in her account that give me a peculiar unease. Vivian Ashworth was the sole heir to Ashworth Manor, a substantial property in the Wiltshire countryside, some 3 hours from London by rail. Her father, Edmund Ashworth, had died 14 months prior, a respiratory illness, swift and unkind, leaving Vivienne the house, the estate, and a considerable fortune held in trust until her 25th birthday, which was, at the time of her visit to us, approximately 8 months away. In the interim, the estate and the trust were managed by her guardian, her father's cousin, a Mr. Silas Pembroke, of whom she spoke with a careful neutrality that I found, even then, faintly telling. "He has been perfectly correct," she said, and it was precisely the word correct that caught my attention. Not kind, not generous, correct. She had been living at the manor since her father's death. She had no other family to speak of. There was a small household staff, a cook, 2 maids, a groundskeeper, but the manor was large and the evenings were long, and she had grown accustomed, she said, to her own company. The whispers had begun on a Wednesday night in late September, and she had been in the library, a long oak-panelled room on the eastern side of the house, 2 floors up, reading by the fire after dinner. Mr. Pembroke had retired early. The house was quiet, and then, quite suddenly, she heard it. It wasn't, she paused, searching for the right words. It wasn't like a voice, not exactly. It was more like a voice behind a voice, as though someone was speaking in another room, and I was only catching the edges of it. But there were no other rooms occupied. I checked. She looked at her hands. "I told myself it was the wind. The manor is old. It makes sounds." But it happened again. and again, always when she was alone, always in the evening, and always, this was the detail that troubled her most, always when she was in certain rooms. The library, the east corridor, and the small sitting room adjacent to her bedchamber. "What did the whispers say?" Holmes asked. His voice was even, carefully neutral. She hesitated. They said things about me, about my mind, that I was becoming like my mother." A pause. "My mother died in an asylum, Mr. Holmes, when I was 4 years old. My father never spoke of it, but I found letters once, when I was a girl. She had episodes, delusions, the doctors called them. She heard things." The room was very quiet. "Mr. Pembroke knows this," Holmes said. It was not quite a question. "He was my father's closest confidant for 30 years, said Vivian. "He knows everything." Holmes was silent for a long moment after she finished. He had not moved from his chair throughout her account, and his face had given nothing away. He and I had watched him, as I always watched him in these early moments of a case, for some flicker of the ignition I knew so well. That subtle brightening, that intake of breath that meant the engine had caught. I did not see it, not immediately. What I saw instead was something rarer, and in its way more interesting. I saw him frown, not with irritation, but with something that looked, if I am honest, rather like uncertainty. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. Stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the fog. "Miss Ashworth," he said without turning, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the answer is uncomfortable." "Yes," she said quietly. "Is it possible, even remotely, even as the smallest of possibilities, that what you are hearing is a product of anxiety, of grief, of the very natural strain of a young woman living alone in a large house following the loss of her father?" It was, I thought, a harder question than it sounds. And to her credit, she did not flinch from it. 6 weeks ago, she said, I would have said yes. I asked myself that every night. I told myself I was tired, overwrought, that I needed air and company and sleep. She lifted her eyes to the back of his head. "But 3 nights ago, Mr. Holmes, the whisper said my name, my full name, and then it said, 'You will end as she ended.'" Holmes turned from the window. Something had changed in his face. I couldn't have said precisely what. The frown was still there, the uncertainty, but beneath it now, there was something else. "When can we come to the manor?" he said. She left Baker Street 20 minutes later with slightly more colour in her face than she had arrived with. And I stood at the window and watched her figure dissolve into the fog below. "Well," I said. Holmes had retrieved his pipe and was attempting to light it with the focused attention of a man who is thinking about something else entirely. "Well, what, Watson? What do you make of it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I make nothing of it yet," he said, which was, for Holmes, a remarkably humble answer. "I have a feeling, and I distrust feelings. They have a habit of preceding the evidence rather than following it, and that is a dangerous order of operations." "But you think something is wrong?" He lit the pipe at last, drew on it once, slowly. "I think," he said carefully, "that either Miss Vivian Ashworth is a remarkably composed young woman on the very edge of a genuine mental collapse," he paused, "or someone very clever is trying to make her appear to be." He dropped into his chair and stared at the ceiling. "I confess," he added after a moment, and in a slightly different tone, quieter, almost to himself, "that I am not entirely certain which prospect troubles me more. Ashworth Manor. We took the Friday morning train from Paddington. Holmes had sent a telegram to Miss Ashworth the previous evening. Brief, practical, asking only that she inform Mr. Pembroke that 2 associates of her late father's solicitor would be visiting to review certain estate documents. A small deception, but a necessary one. Holmes had explained it to me on the way to the station, as standing on the platform, with his collar turned up against a wind that had come in sharp and purposeful overnight. "If Pembroke is behind this in any capacity," he said, watching the locomotive approach through the grey morning air, "then the last thing we want is for him to know who we are, before we've had a chance to look at the place with fresh eyes." "And if he's not behind it?" I asked. Holmes picked up his bag. "Then we are 2 associates of her late father's solicitor, and we review estate documents, and we go home." He paused, "though I don't think that's what's going to happen." I didn't either. The journey took just under 3 hours. Holmes spent most of it in silence, which I had long since stopped taking personally. He sat with his forehead nearly touching the window, watching the countryside unreal, London's grey sprawl giving way slowly, grudgingly, to the quieter palette of Wiltshire, bare November fields and stone walls, and the occasional stand of trees stripped down to their architecture by the season. I read. I watched him occasionally. I ate the sandwich Mrs. Hudson had pressed into my coat pocket with the wordless insistence she used when she suspected we were heading toward trouble. It was just past noon when we arrived at the village of Ashworth Crossing, a small, self-contained sort of place, the kind that has a church and a public house and not much else, and seems quite content with the arrangement. A trap had been sent to meet us. The driver, a weathered man of 50-odd who gave his name only as Griggs, loaded our bags without ceremony and set off at a pace that suggested he had done this particular journey more times than he cared to count. The manor appeared around a long bend in the lane, and I will admit that my first sight of it produced something I can only describe as an involuntary sobriety. It was not a ruin. It was too well maintained for that. The grounds kept, the stonework sound, but it had the quality of a place that has absorbed a great deal of history, and not all of it cheerful. 3 stories of pale Wiltshire stone, broad and symmetrical, with tall windows that caught the flat November light and gave nothing back. A row of bare chestnuts lined the approach, their branches interlocking overhead like fingers. The sky behind the house was the colour of an old pewter dish. "Charming," said Holmes, in a tone that suggested he found it nothing of the sort but was professionally interested nonetheless. Silas Pembroke met us in the entrance hall. I had formed a picture of him in my mind during the train journey, assembled, as one does, from the few details Vivian had given us. Her careful neutrality, the word correct, the 30 years of intimacy with her father. I had imagined someone older, softer, the comfortable avuncular type that slides into positions of trust through sheer long acquaintance. The man who came forward to shake our hands was not that. Pembroke was perhaps 60, lean in the way that suggests not fitness but vigilance, as though his body had long ago learned to keep something in reserve. His hair was silver and neatly parted. His clothes were good, not ostentatious, but considered every detail chosen. His handshake was firm and held a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. His eyes were pale, a washed-out blue that I have since come to associate, perhaps unfairly, with men who have learned to make their faces say one thing while their minds arrange another. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he smiled, warm, easy, practiced. "Vivian mentioned you might be coming. Associates of Carver and Webb, I understand. "That's correct," said Holmes pleasantly. "Splendid. I've had rooms prepared." He gestured toward the staircase, wide oak banistered, the kind that was built to impress and still did. "I hope your journey wasn't too disagreeable. The Friday trains from Paddington can be trying." "Not at all," I said. Holmes was looking at the entrance hall. I recognized the look, that slow, a systematic visual sweep that he performed so naturally that most people took it for idle glancing. He was cataloguing. The height of the ceilings, considerable. The oak paneling that ran the lower half of every wall, old, dark, beautifully fitted. The placement of the doors, the depth of the architraves, the way sound behaved in the space. And it did behave oddly. I noticed it myself, a faint resonance, as though the room were larger on the inside than it appeared. "Remarkable house," Holmes said, turning to Pembroke with an expression of polite appreciation. "How old is the structure?" "The main body dates to 1743, said Pembroke, with the particular pride of a man who has come to think of something as his through long proximity. "Various additions since. The east wing was rebuilt in 1801 following a fire, and the original architect was a pupil of Vanbrugh. You can see his influence in the proportions." "Indeed," said Holmes. "And the panelling, original throughout?" "Throughout the ground and first floors, yes." Pembroke's eyes moved to Holmes with an attention that was just slightly too measured. "You have an interest in architecture, mister. Forgive me, which of you is Holmes and which Watson?" "I am Holmes. Of course, a beat. You have an interest in architecture, Mr. Holmes?" "A passing one," said Holmes. "Old houses interest me, the things they contain." It was a perfectly ordinary sentence. There was no particular emphasis on any word. And yet something moved behind Pembroke's pale eyes, gone too quickly to name, before his smile reasserted itself. "Quite," he said. "Shall I show you to your rooms?" Vivian joined us for dinner, and she looked better than she had in Baker Street. Or rather, she was making a more sustained effort to look better, which is not quite the same thing. She had dressed carefully, and she spoke during the meal with a composure that I suspected cost her considerably. Pembroke sat at the head of the table and steered the conversation with the easy authority of a man entirely at home, and perhaps that was what unsettled me most about him, the degree to which he seemed at home. More so, I thought, than Vivian herself. The dining room was handsome, candlelit, high-ceilinged, the walls panelled in the same dark oak as the hall. Holmes ate with reasonable appetite, which was unusual enough to note, and spoke very little, which was not. He asked Pembroke occasional questions about the estate, the farms, the tenancies, of the management of the trust, and Pembroke answered them all with fluent, comprehensive detail. He was, whatever else he might be, thoroughly across the finances. After dinner, Pembroke excused himself early. "A correspondence to attend to," he said. He bid us good night with the same warm, practiced smile, and left the three of us alone in the drawing room, with the fire and the brandy decanter. Vivian waited until she heard his footsteps reach the floor above. "He knows who you are," she said quietly. Holmes looked up from his brandy. "What makes you say so?" "The way he looked at you when you arrived. I've known Silas Pembroke my entire life, Mr. Holmes, and I know the difference between when he is surprised and when he is pretending to be." She set down her glass. "He was not surprised." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Oh, it changes nothing immediately," Holmes said after a moment. "If anything, it may be useful. A man who believes he is the observer rarely watches as carefully as he should." He paused. "Miss Ashworth, the rooms where the whispers occur. Can you show me tomorrow morning in the light?" "Yes," she said, "of course." Good." He looked at the fire. "Try to sleep. And if you hear anything tonight, anything at all, do not go toward it. Come and wake Watson." She looked at him. "Not you." "Watson has a more immediately reassuring presence," Holmes said with a brief, dry, almost smile. "I'm afraid I tend to make things feel more serious than they already are." It was, I thought, an oddly self-aware thing for him to say. Vivian almost smiled back. "I slept eventually. I always do," which Holmes has at various times described as both my greatest virtue and my most significant professional liability. My room was on the first floor, East Corridor, a large, adequately furnished room that smelled of old wood and lavender, and the particular dusty cold of rooms that are heated only when occupied. I read for perhaps an hour, listened to the house settle around me, the creaks and murmurs that old houses produce as a matter of course, the low percussion of the wind against the windows, and then I put out the lamp and lay in the dark and let the quiet do its work. I don't know precisely what time it was when I woke. Late, the fire had gone to embers. The room was very dark. I lay still for a moment, the way one does when woken by something uncertain, trying to determine whether I had dreamed it or, there, very faint. A very low, not words exactly, or not words I could make out, but a sound that was undeniably vocal, undeniably human, coming from somewhere that was not an adjacent room, not the corridor, not anywhere I could place with confidence. It seemed to come from the wall itself. From inside the wall, from behind the paneling, from some intermediate space between here and somewhere else. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then it stopped. I sat up in bed. The room was entirely silent. I reached for the lamp, struck a match, and in the small, warm circle of light, I sat and listened for another full minute. Nothing. The house breathed its ordinary nighttime breath. Timber, wind, settling stone. Whatever I had heard was gone. I got up, put on my dressing gown, and went to knock on Holmes's door. He answered before I had finished knocking. He was fully dressed. "You heard it," I said. "Yes," he said. He was standing in the middle of his room, not by the bed, not by the window, but in the center of the room, as though he had been standing there for some time, very still, simply listening. His expression was one I had seen before, the particular focused blankness of a man whose mind is working so hard it has temporarily vacated his face. But there was something else in it tonight. Something that I am not sure I can accurately describe, having so rarely seen it there. He looked, if I'm not overstating it, shaken, not frightened. That is not the right word, and I do not think Holmes was frightened in any conventional sense, but unsettled, as though something had occurred that did not yet fit inside any of his existing frameworks. And his existing frameworks were, for him, a great deal of his identity. "I heard it clearly," he said quietly, "more clearly than I expected." A pause. I understood a word, one word. Another pause, shorter. "My name," I stared at him. "Your name? My name?" He turned away and walked to the window. "Which is interesting," he said in a tone that suggested he found it considerably more than interesting, because if this was simple grief-induced auditory suggestion on Miss Ashworth's part, it would not say my name. It would not know my name. He put his hand flat against the wall beside the window, the panelled wall, and held it there. And if it is merely the wind, or the architecture, or any of the other perfectly rational explanations I have been quietly entertaining since Baker Street. He paused, pressing his palm more firmly against the oak. Then it has a remarkably specific imagination. He stood like that for a moment. Then he took his hand away. "Go back to bed, Watson," he said. "Are you serious?" "No," he admitted, "but try at least." I did not sleep again that night, and I am reasonably confident Holmes did not either. In the morning, over a breakfast at which Pembroke was gracious and attentive, and Vivian was quiet and Holmes was entirely unreadable, I found myself looking at the walls of the dining room, the dark-fitted, beautifully crafted panelling with a different kind of attention than I had brought to them the evening before. They looked the same. Of course they did. Solid, old, silent in the grey morning light. But I had heard what I had heard. And Holmes, who trusted almost nothing he could not measure, had pressed his hand against the wall in the dark and stood there with something uncertain in his face. And somewhere inside those walls, I was now quite sure, something was listening back. The walls have voices. Holmes did not speak about what he had heard that night. Not at breakfast, not during the brief polite exchange with Pembroke over the morning's plans, not even when we were alone together in the corridor afterward. He simply set it aside, folded it away somewhere internal, and proceeded, which was, I had come to understand over the years, not the same thing as dismissing it. Holmes never dismissed anything. He merely decided when each thing would be useful. And until that moment, he kept it somewhere it wouldn't interfere. What he did that Saturday morning, it was begin to look at the house. Not the way he had looked at it the day before, that first sweeping inventory of a new space. This was different. This was the focused, methodical, almost affectionate attention he brought to problems that had genuinely caught him. The kind of looking that goes so slowly, it becomes something closer to thinking. He started in the library. It was the first room Vivian had mentioned, the place where the whispers had begun, that Wednesday night in late September. A long room, east-facing, 2 tall windows overlooking the frost-stiffened garden, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, oak-panelled below the shelving, a deep fireplace at the far end, the smell of old books and cold ash and something underneath both of those, something faintly mineral, faintly structural, the smell of the house itself. Vivian stood near the door and watched him. I watched him too. He moved along the panelled walls with his knuckles tapping, not randomly, but in a pattern, working left to right, top to bottom, listening to the sound each tap produced with his head tilted at a slight angle. Most of the panels returned a flat, solid knock. Occasionally, one returned something fractionally different, a shade hollower, a suggestion of space behind. Each time Holmes paused, tapped again, moved on. "What is he doing?" Vivian asked me quietly. "Listening to the walls," I said. She looked at me as though she wasn't sure whether this was reassuring or not. I wasn't entirely sure myself. Holmes reached the far end of the room, the chimney breast, flanked on either side by built-in shelving, and stopped as he tapped the panelling to the left of the fireplace, solid. He tapped the right side, also solid. He stepped back and looked at the fireplace itself, then at the ceiling, then at the floor. "Watson," he said without turning, "come and stand here." I crossed the room and stood beside him. "Look at the cornice," he said, "above the fireplace. Follow it left, all the way to the corner." I looked. The cornice was the same throughout. An elaborate plasterwork design running along the junction of wall and ceiling, deep and projecting, the kind of ornamental excess the 18th century was particularly fond of. It ran consistently along 3 walls. On the 4th wall, the wall to the right of the fireplace, the external wall with the windows, it didn't quite match, not dramatically. You would never notice it if you weren't looking for it. But the profile was fractionally shallower, the pattern very slightly simpler, and at 2 points along its length there were small dark apertures, barely visible, set into the deepest part of the moulding. "What are those?" I said. "That," said Holmes quietly, "is what I have been looking for since 7:30 this morning." He pulled the armchair from beside the fireplace, positioned it beneath the cornice, and stood on it. He brought his face close to one of the apertures and was still for a moment. Then he took a folded paper from his pocket, tore a small strip, and held it near the opening. The paper moved, not much, just a faint, unmistakable tremor, the suggestion of a current of air from somewhere inside the wall. Holmes stepped down from the chair and stood very still in the middle of the room with the expression of a man who has just had a suspicion confirmed and is not particularly glad about it. "Acoustic tubes," he said. The words landed quietly in the room. Vivian made a small sound, not quite a word, hidden inside the walls, Holmes continued, his voice measured, deliberate, almost certainly running between multiple rooms. The apertures are concealed within the cornice molding, invisible from normal standing height, inaudible unless you know precisely what you're hearing. He looked at Vivian. "Sound, Miss Ashworth, is a remarkable thing. Under the right conditions, the right frequencies, through the right medium, a human voice can travel a considerable distance through a narrow tube and emerge in another room as something that appears to come from—" He paused, and for a moment something moved across his face that wasn't quite detachment. From everywhere and nowhere at once, from the walls themselves. Vivian sat down in the armchair Holmes had just vacated. Not gracefully, she simply sat, as though her legs had made the decision independently. "Someone has been speaking into these tubes," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was very flat. "Yes." "From where?" "That," said Holmes, "is what we need to find next." He spent the next 2 hours with a measuring tape. I assisted, holding one end while he walked the other along corridors, into rooms across landings, and Vivian followed us, mostly silent, he occasionally pointing out features of the house that Holmes asked about. Pembroke had gone out on estate business after breakfast, which Holmes had noted with a brief, satisfied nod that told me he had expected and possibly engineered it, though I couldn't have said how. The measuring tape told a story. The East Wing, which had been rebuilt following the 1801 fire, as Pembroke had mentioned at dinner, was in several places measurably inconsistent. Rooms that should have been adjacent weren't quite. Corridors that should have met at a certain point were slightly too short. There were, when you began specifically looking for them, a number of small spaces that didn't belong to any room. Gaps in the architecture, voids between walls, narrow channels that served no structural purpose. Holmes found the access point in the early afternoon. It was in the east corridor, first floor, a stretch of paneling between the linen closet and the door to a disused bedroom. There was nothing visually remarkable about it. But Holmes had been measuring the corridor against the room on its other side and had identified a discrepancy of approximately 14 inches, a gap that the house did not account for. He ran his hands along the paneling slowly, feeling the joins between panels, pressed at intervals along the lower molding. Then, with a soft but definitive click, a section of the wall, 3 feet wide, floor to ceiling, swung inward. The three of us stood and looked at what was behind it. A passage. Narrow enough that a broad-shouldered man would have moved through it sideways, and dark, the darkness of a space that has had no business being lit, and the walls on either side were bare stone, the original fabric of the house predating the 1801 rebuild. At intervals along both walls ran the tubes, thin, perhaps an inch in diameter, made of what appeared in the dimness to be lead, fitted into channels cut deliberately into the stonework. They ran horizontally, vertically, branching occasionally. the whole arrangement having the appearance, in the thin light of Holmes's match, of a peculiar mechanical nervous system threaded through the body of the house. "Good God," I said. "Indeed," said Holmes. He stepped inside, match raised, and followed the passage perhaps 20 feet before the match burned down. He lit another, continued. I followed him. Behind me, I heard Vivian's breathing. Steady, deliberate, the breathing of someone maintaining control by conscious effort. And the passage ended at a small alcove, barely large enough for a man to stand in comfortably, positioned, by my estimation, directly behind the panelling of the small sitting room adjacent to Vivian's bedchamber. At standing height in this alcove, one tube terminated in a slightly wider fitting, a mouthpiece, crude but functional, angled so that a person standing here could speak directly into it. Around the mouthpiece on the stone wall were faint marks. The kind of marks a man's shoulder makes when he leans against a wall in the same position repeatedly over a period of weeks. Holmes crouched and examined the floor of the alcove. Stone, mostly, but near the base of the wall there was a thin scatter of something. He touched it with one finger, brought it to his nose. "Candle wax," he said quietly. "Recent. The colour suggests beeswax, the better quality kind, not servant's tallow." He straightened up. In the close, cold space of the passage, he seemed very still, and his face in the matchlight had the concentrated inward expression of a man who is assembling something he already knows the shape of, and is only now confirming the dimensions. "He stood here," Holmes said, "in the dark, on multiple occasions." A pause, and he spoke her mother's fate back at her, through these walls, in the dark. Another pause, shorter and with a different quality to it, knowing exactly what it would do. He blew out the match. For a moment, we were in complete darkness, the three of us in the cold belly of the old house. And in that moment, the silence was absolute and particular, the silence of a hidden place that has kept its secret for weeks, and has now, finally, been found out. Then Holmes lit another match, and we made our way back to the panel and out into the corridor. And I pulled the panel shut behind us with a click that seemed, in the circumstances, almost satisfying. Vivian was standing with her back against the opposite wall of the corridor. She was not crying. She had the look of a woman who has perhaps moved through crying into something quieter and harder on the other side. "He did this," she said, not loudly. Holmes looked at her for a moment. "I believe so, yes." "He stood in there, in the dark, and said those things to me." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "About my mother, yes." She looked at Holmes. Her eyes were steady and very clear. How long had he been planning it?" Holmes was quiet for a moment. "The tubes themselves are not new," he said carefully. "The fittings, the channels cut into the stone, that work is old, possibly as old as the 1801 rebuild. It is possible the system existed for another purpose entirely and was simply repurposed." He paused. "What is certain is that the access panel has been used recently. The hinges have been oiled. The floor of the alcove has been used repeatedly. The planning, at whatever scale, has been ongoing for some time." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "He's been waiting," she said. "He's been waiting for the right moment and the right instrument." It was, I thought, an extraordinarily precise word for what had been done to her, and Holmes registered it with a small, grave nod. "Miss Ashworth," he said, I need you to do something difficult." She looked at him. "I need you to behave, for the remainder of today and this evening, as though nothing has changed, as though we have found nothing. Can you do that?" A long pause. "Yes," she said. "Good." He looked at the closed panel in the wall. Unremarkable now, invisible, just another stretch of oak in a house full of oak. Because tonight, I intend to set a trap. And for the trap to work, the spider needs to believe he is still safely in his web. The spider in his web, Holmes, explained the plan to me that afternoon in my room, speaking quietly and with the particular economy of a man who has already thought through every variable and is now simply reading the conclusion aloud. It was elegant, as his traps tended to be, not complicated. In fact, its effectiveness depended almost entirely on its simplicity. He had always maintained, and I had come over the years to agree, that the most reliable snares are not the intricate ones, but the ones that work with human nature rather than against it. A greedy man, properly baited, will almost always take the bait. Not because he is stupid, Pembroke was evidently not stupid, but because greed has a way of narrowing the field of vision. It makes a man focus so intently on the thing he wants that he stops adequately examining the ground beneath his feet. "This evening," Holmes said, keeping his voice low, "after dinner, when Pembroke has retired, or appears to have retired, you and I will have a conversation in the East Corridor, audible, unguarded, the conversation of two men who believe themselves entirely alone. And the substance of the conversation," I said, "you will tell me that you received a telegram this afternoon from Dr. Fenwick of the Harley Street practice, a nerve specialist of some repute." He paused. "You will tell me that Miss Ashworth's guardian, acting, you will say, with great concern for her welfare, has already been in correspondence with Dr. Fenwick, and that a formal psychiatric examination has been arranged for Monday morning. That if the examination confirms what her guardian fears, the process of having her declared legally incompetent will proceed through the courts." I looked at him. Has Pembroke actually done this? "I have no idea," said Holmes, "but he intends to. Everything we have seen points to a man in the final stages of a carefully constructed plan. The timing is not accidental. Her 25th birthday is 8 months away. If he is going to move, he will move soon." He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor. I am giving him what he believes is his final confirmation. The thing he has been engineering for 6 weeks. Proof that she is breaking down, combined with a legal mechanism already in motion. Tonight, he will believe everything is falling into place. And then he will be unable to resist using the tubes one final time to push her over the edge in case any doubt remains, to make certain. Holmes looked up, and I will be in the passage waiting for him. I considered this, and if he doesn't take the bait. Holmes was briefly, almost imperceptibly quiet. "Then I am wrong about him," he said, "and I will need to reconsider considerably." He said it in the tone of a man who has genuinely allowed for the possibility, which was, in its way, more unsettling than certainty would have been. "But I don't think I'm wrong, Watson." "No," I said, "neither do I." We told Vivian the plan over tea, while Pembroke was out inspecting the north field with the groundskeeper, a piece of scheduling that Holmes had quietly encouraged over breakfast by expressing an interest in the estate's drainage arrangements, which had sent Pembroke off with the proprietary energy of a man who enjoys demonstrating his competence. Vivian listened to Holmes in silence, her teacup held in both hands. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You want me to go to bed as normal?" she said. "And wait. Yes. Knowing he may come. Yes. Though he will not reach you, he cannot. The passage has no exit into your room, only the acoustic connection. The worst that happens is that you hear his voice." Holmes paused, which I appreciate is not a small thing. She set down her cup. "No," she said quietly, "it is not a small thing." A pause. "But I have been hearing his voice in the dark for 6 weeks. Without knowing it was him, Mr. Holmes. Knowing, she stopped, looked at her hands. Knowing is better. Knowing I can bear. Holmes looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, brief, genuine, almost immediately set aside. Yes, he said simply. I rather think you can. Dinner that evening was the most demanding performance I have participated in outside of actual theatre. Pembroke was in good spirits. Better spirits, I thought, than he had been the previous evening. There was a looseness to him, a satisfaction that he was working to conceal beneath his usual smooth cordiality, but that came through nonetheless in small ways. The way he refilled his own glass with just slightly more enthusiasm than the occasion demanded. The way he laughed a beat too readily at his own remarks. The way his eyes moved to Vivian periodically with an attention he was trying to make look like concern, and which looked to me like something considerably colder. Holmes was Holmes, perfectly pleasant, perfectly opaque, asking Pembroke about the history of the estate with what appeared to be genuine curiosity and was almost certainly not. I ate my lamb and made conversation, and watched Vivian hold herself together across the table with a steadiness that I found, frankly, remarkable. After dinner, Pembroke lingered over his port, long enough that I began to wonder whether he intended to retire at all, which would have complicated things considerably, before finally excusing himself just before 10 o'clock. Fatigue, he said. The Northfield inspection had been more involved than anticipated. He wished us all a warm good night, pressed Vivian's hand briefly, and said he hoped she would sleep well, and went upstairs. We sat in the drawing room for 30 minutes after that. Holmes read, or appeared to read, a journal. I stared at the fire. Vivian sat very still with a book open in her lap, and her eyes not moving across the page. At 10:30, Holmes closed his journal. It looked at Vivian and gave a very small nod. She stood, said good night in a voice entirely her own, and went upstairs. Holmes and I waited another 10 minutes. Then we went out into the east corridor. We stood perhaps 10 feet apart in the corridor, close enough to conduct a natural conversation, far enough that it would carry. The corridor was unlit save for the lamp Holmes carried, and the shadows were long, and the old house was in its nighttime register. That deep, resonant quiet of thick walls and cold air and time. I spoke first, keeping my voice at the level of a man who is being discreet but not whispering. I received a telegram this afternoon, I said, from Fenwick on Harley Street. Holmes looked at me, said nothing. In the lamplight, his face was attentive, waiting. It seems the arrangements are already further along than I realized, I continued. Pembroke has been corresponding with him for some weeks. The examination is set for Monday morning. I paused. If Fenwick finds what Pembroke believes he will find, and given what I have observed this weekend, Watson, I think he may, then the legal process can begin within the fortnight. Holmes was quiet for a moment, as though absorbing this. The inheritance, he said. Held in trust until 25, I said. If she is declared incompetent before that birthday, guardianship extends indefinitely. The trustee's discretionary powers become substantial. Another pause. Holmes shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man reluctantly confronting an unpleasant truth. Poor girl, he said quietly. Would I wonder if she has any idea how far along this is? I don't think she does, I said. I don't think she has any idea at all. Holmes sighed, a long, tired sound, and said, Well, there is nothing to be done about it tonight. Come, let's turn in. We went to our rooms. Holmes, of course, did not go to sleep. He gave it 20 minutes, enough time for anyone listening to believe the corridor was empty, the house settled, the night established. Then, in darkness, without a lamp, he made his way back to the panel in the east corridor wall and pressed it open and stepped inside. He had described his plan for this part to me beforehand. He would go to the alcove at the far end of the passage and wait. He would not light a match unless absolutely necessary. He would simply stand in the dark and listen and be patient, which was, as I had observed over many years, one of Holmes's least advertised but most formidable qualities. He could be very, very still when he chose, in a way that most active men cannot. His body could be entirely quiet, while his mind went on working at full speed. He waited for 40 minutes, then he heard footsteps in the passage. He told me about it afterward in the early hours of the morning, and I will recount his account as faithfully as I can. The footsteps were careful, slow, heel to toe, the practiced quiet of a man who had made this journey many times and knew exactly where to place his feet. A faint light preceded them. Candlelight, the warm, unsteady glow of it moving along the stone walls, throwing the lead tubes into sharp, shifting relief. Holmes pressed himself against the wall of the passage and watched the light approach. Pembroke came around the narrow bend in the passage and into the alcove. He was in his dressing gown, a dark one, burgundy perhaps, though the candlelight made colours unreliable. He carried a single candle in a small brass holder. His silver hair was loose at the temples, his face without the social architecture of the dinner table. And Holmes said that what he saw there, in that unguarded private face lit from below by candle glow in a stone passage in the belly of the house, was not the warm, careful man of the dining room. It was something considerably more purposeful, more focused. The face, Holmes said, of a man doing a job. Pembroke set the candle on a small ledge cut into the stone, worn smooth, Holmes noted, and in the way that a surface is worn when something is placed on it regularly, and leaned toward the mouthpiece of the tube. Holmes stepped out of the darkness. "Good evening, Mr. Pembroke," he said. What happened in the next few seconds was, Holmes told me, rather undignified on Pembroke's part, and I will not dwell on it. A man startled in a confined stone passage with a candle is not at his best. There was a sound and a stumble, and the candle very nearly went out. When Pembroke recovered himself, which took longer than a man of his composure would have wished, he straightened up and looked at Holmes with an expression that was, Holmes said, almost admirably rapid in its transition from shock to something approaching control. "Mr. Holmes," he said. His voice was steady. "You gave me quite a fright." "I imagine I did," said Holmes. A silence. Pembroke's eyes moved to the tube, to the mouthpiece, to Holmes, and back. "This passage," Pembroke said carefully, "is a structural feature of the house, part of the original." "Please," said Holmes. Pembroke stopped. Holmes looked at him in the candlelight, looked at him for a long, unhurried moment with the kind of attention that leaves nowhere to hide, and said, "I have been a great many things in my professional life, Mr. Pembroke. Patient, usually, occasionally mistaken. Sometimes, I will confess, rather slower than I should be." A pause. "I am not, however, stupid, and I am profoundly tired of standing in cold stone passages in the middle of the night. So, I suggest we dispense with the architecture lecture and discuss what you were about to say into that tube." Pembroke said nothing. You were going to speak to her," Holmes said. "One final time, one final push, just to be certain she arrived at Monday's appointment in the appropriate state of mind. Just to be certain there was no chance of recovery before Fenwick got his hands on her." His voice was even, unhurried, carrying no particular heat, which made it, somehow, more damning. 6 weeks of standing in here in the dark, Mr. Pembroke, speaking her mother's history back at her through the walls. Choosing your words with great care, I imagine, specific enough to be terrifying, vague enough to be deniable. Knowing exactly what it would do to a young woman who grew up in the shadow of her mother's fate. He paused. That is not a crime of impulse. That is architecture of a different kind. Pembroke's jaw moved slightly. You have no proof of... I have the passage, Holmes said. I have the tubes. I have the wear patterns on this floor and this wall and that ledge, he gestured, that indicate sustained, repeated use over a period of weeks. I have the oiled hinges on the access panel. I have Miss Ashworth's testimony. I have your correspondence with Dr. Fenwick of Harley Street, which, I suspect, will prove rather illuminating when Inspector Lestrade examines it, as he will be doing by Monday morning at the latest. He tilted his head slightly. I also have Watson, who heard everything we said in the corridor this evening, including the part about the inheritance and the legal process and the extension of guardianship, and who will be entirely willing to explain in court exactly why we said it and what it was designed to produce. He looked at Pembroke steadily, which it did. The silence in the passage was very complete. Pembroke's composure, which had been impressive under the circumstances, showed its first genuine fracture. Not dramatically, not in the way of theatrical villains, not with fury or denials or threats. It cracked quietly, the way old plaster cracks, along a line that had probably been there for some time. He looked for a moment, simply tired. 30 years, he said. His voice had changed, the social warmth entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was flatter, harder, and in its way more honest. 30 years I managed that man's estate, his investments, his affairs, every decision of consequence that family made for 3 decades passed through my hands. He stopped. Something moved in his face. And he left it to her, a girl of 24 who cannot manage a household account. His mouth tightened. Everything I built, everything I protected, handed over to a child on her birthday like a party favor. It was not yours, Holmes said. It was as good as mine, Pembroke said, and the conviction in his voice was genuine. And that, Holmes told me later, was perhaps the most chilling thing about him. He believed it. In whatever accounting he kept of the world's obligations, 30 years of service had, in his reckoning, purchased what he had tried to take. It should have been mine. And so you decided, Holmes said quietly, to take it. Pembroke looked at him. I decided to correct an injustice. You decided, Holmes said with a precision that was not unkind but absolute, to drive a young woman to madness, using her dead mother as the instrument, and to have her locked away in an asylum so that you could administer her estate indefinitely. He paused. That is not a correction, Mr. Pembroke. That is a crime. Several crimes, in fact. And I would encourage you to begin thinking clearly about your situation, because it is about to become considerably more formal. A long silence. Then Pembroke's shoulders dropped, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, and something went out of his face. Not guilt, not quite, but the abandonment of a position that had become untenable. A general standing down. I would like, he said after a moment, to sit down. There is nowhere to sit in here, Holmes said. I suggest we go upstairs. I was waiting in the corridor when they came through the panel. I had been there for perhaps 15 minutes. Holmes had signalled me, as arranged, by the simple method of knocking twice on the wall from inside, which had produced in me a feeling simultaneously absurd and profound. And I had spent those 15 minutes standing very still in the dark corridor, with my heart beating somewhat more urgently than I would have preferred, when the panel swung open and Holmes stepped through, followed by Pembroke in his dressing gown. I looked at Holmes's face. He gave me a brief, small nod. It was done. Pembroke sat in the chair in the drawing room and said very little more that night. There was, I think, nothing left to say. Holmes sent me upstairs to wake Vivian. Gently, I told her gently, and I tried to be. And she came down in her dressing gown, with her hair loose, and stood in the doorway of the drawing room, and looked at the man who had been her guardian for 14 months, and her father's trusted companion for 3 decades, sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace with his hands in his lap and his silver head slightly bowed. She looked at him for a long time. He did not look back. I will send a telegram to Inspector Lestrade first thing in the morning, Holmes said to Vivian quietly. By this time tomorrow, this will be in the hands of the appropriate authorities. She nodded. She didn't say anything. I am not sure there was anything to say. She looked at Pembroke one final time, and the expression on her face in that moment was something I found difficult to characterize and have thought about since. It was not rage, though she had every right to rage. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than either of those. The expression, I thought, of a person looking at a thing they once trusted and understanding, fully and finally, exactly what it was. Then she turned and went back upstairs. Justice and silent morning came slowly to Ashworth Manor. It arrived the way November mornings do in the English countryside, not with any particular announcement, but as a gradual lessening of dark, the black of the windows softening to grey, the shapes of the garden assembling themselves reluctantly out of the mist. I had not slept. I do not think anyone in the house had slept, with the possible exception of the kitchen maid, who had no idea what had occurred, and would piece it together later from fragments of conversation and the arrival of the police, in the way that household staff always do. I sat in the drawing room until the light was sufficient to read by, and then I did not read. I simply sat, which is sometimes the most honest response to a long night. Holmes had been busy since 4 in the morning. He had searched Pembroke's study, with Pembroke present, supervised, saying nothing, and had found what he was looking for within the first 20 minutes. A correspondence file, neatly maintained, the kind of meticulous record-keeping that speaks of a man who trusted systems more than people. Letters to and from Dr. Fenwick, detailing Vivian's supposed deterioration, written in Pembroke's careful hand, clinical, concerned, utterly fabricated. A draft documents relating to an application for a committee of the person, the legal mechanism by which a person deemed mentally incompetent could be placed under the permanent guardianship of another. Financial projections, and these were perhaps the most damning of all, laid out in columns with the dispassionate clarity of a man for whom the human cost of a plan is simply not a relevant variable. Holmes had set them on the desk and looked at them for a moment, without touching them further. 30 years, he said to me quietly later, in a tone I could not entirely read. He spent 30 years building toward this, waiting, serving, accumulating the trust that would make the plan possible. A pause. There is a patience in that which is almost... He stopped, shook his head slightly. Almost. He never finished the sentence. I did not ask him to. The telegram to Lestrade went at 7 in the morning, carried to the village by Griggs, who asked no questions and whose expression suggested he had seen enough of the world to find that the wisest policy. Inspector Lestrade arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon with a sergeant and a constable, and the particular expression he wore when Holmes had sent for him. a compound of professional dignity, mild irritation at being summoned to the countryside, and the carefully concealed relief of a man who has learned, over years of collaboration, that when Holmes calls it is because the work has largely been done, and he will not be required to do very much except make the arrest look official. Holmes met him in the entrance hall and spent 45 minutes walking him through everything: the passage, the tubes, the alcove, the correspondence, the financial documents, the design and execution of the whole scheme, with the thorough, slightly pedagogical manner he adopted when briefing Lestrade, which Lestrade endured with the stoicism of a man who has made his peace with being taught things he feels he should probably have known already. I watched from the doorway of the library. Pembroke was arrested at 3:20. He came downstairs in his overcoat. He had dressed properly, I noticed, precisely knotted tie, hair neatly combed, the full armor of his social presentation back in place. And he submitted to the process with a composure that was either genuine or the most sustained piece of acting I have witnessed. He said nothing to Holmes. He said nothing to me. At the door he paused and turned, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something to Vivian, who was standing at the foot of the staircase. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He turned and went out through the door with the sergeant, and the sound of the carriage on the gravel drive faded slowly into the mist. And that was the last I saw of Silas Pembroke. The house was very quiet after they left. Vivian stood at the foot of the staircase for a moment, after the sound of the carriage had gone. Then she sat down on the bottom step, not carefully, not with any of the composed arrangement she had maintained throughout the weekend, but simply sat, as though her body had finally handed in its notice. She put her face in her hands. I went and sat beside her on the step, which was not particularly comfortable for either of us, and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and sometimes the most honest thing one can offer another person is simply the fact of one's presence. After a moment, she lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were wet, but her expression was not broken. It was, if anything, steadier than it had been all weekend. The particular steadiness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has just set it down and is now simply standing in the unfamiliar lightness of its absence. "Is it strange," she said quietly, "that what I feel most is not anger?" "What do you feel?" I asked. She thought about it genuinely, in the way of someone who has decided to be honest with themselves about something. "Tired," she said, and she paused, relieved, "and that I'm not mad." She said the last word with a particular weight that told me exactly how much of the past 6 weeks she had spent genuinely uncertain of the answer. That the walls weren't actually speaking. A small, exhausted sound that was almost a laugh. That I am not my mother. "You were never going to be your mother," I said. She looked at me. "You don't know that?" "No," I admitted. "But what I do know is that a woman losing her grip on reality does not come to Baker Street, sit calmly in front of Sherlock Holmes, describe her symptoms with precision and self-awareness, and then endure a weekend of considerable strain without once losing her composure." I paused. "That is not madness, Miss Ashworth. That is rather the opposite of it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was very cruel, wasn't he? And what he chose to use." She meant her mother. She meant the specific surgical selection of that particular fear, the most private, most inherited, most unanswerable fear a person can carry, and the decision to aim it at her in the dark, night after night, from inside the walls of her own home. "Yes," I said, "he was very cruel." Holmes found us there a few minutes later and had the tact, and it was tact, whatever he might say about it, to simply pull a chair from the hallway, position it nearby, and sit in it without comment or ceremony. The three of us sat in the entrance hall of Ashworth Manor in the grey November afternoon, the mist pressing gently against the tall windows, the house around us breathing its old, slow breath. After a while, Holmes said in a voice that was carefully ordinary, "Ian, the legal situation will need to be addressed. The trust documents, the guardianship arrangements, all of it will need to be reviewed and reassigned. Carver and Webb are genuinely your father's solicitors, I believe, and now would be an appropriate time to actually consult them." A pause. "You will also, I imagine, want to review the estate accounts with some thoroughness." Vivian nodded. "Yes." A breath. "I know more about the estate than Silas believed I did. My father talked to me about it in the last months. I think he knew something was—" She stopped. "He never said it directly, but I think he knew." Holmes looked at her. "Then he knew what he was leaving it to," he said. It was not the kind of thing Holmes said easily or often, and Vivian understood that, and for a moment her eyes were bright again. "Thank you," she said. "You, both of you." Holmes shifted in his chair with the mild discomfort of a man receiving something he does not know quite how to hold. "It is what we came for," he said, which was true, and also, I thought, not entirely the whole truth. We took the evening train back to London. Griggs drove us to the station in the same unhurried way he had collected us, the trap moving through lanes that were thoroughly dark now, the mist having thickened into something more committed as evening came on. Holmes sat with his coat collar turned up and his hands in his pockets and looked out at the darkness passing by, and I sat beside him and let the motion of the wheels and the cold air and the sound of the horses' hooves do what they do, which is help the mind find its way back to ordinary things after extraordinary ones. At the station, waiting on the platform, Holmes lit his pipe and smoked in silence for several minutes. "She'll be all right," I said. I wasn't asking. "Yes," said Holmes. "She will." A pause. The signal lamp at the end of the platform swung gently in the wind. "The tubes," I said. "You don't think he built them?" "No, the stonework is far too old. Someone built that passage in 1801 during the rebuild, whether for servant access, for privacy, for some other domestic purpose I couldn't say. It sat dormant for 80 years. He drew on his pipe. And then a man with a specific need and a detailed knowledge of the house discovered it and recognized what it could be made to do. "He must have found it years ago," I said, "to have planned this so thoroughly. I think so, yes. I think he found it and filed it away. And waited until he had sufficient motivation to use it." Holmes was quiet for a moment. The timing matters. Her father's death created the opportunity. Her birthday created the deadline. The passage was simply an instrument that happened to be available. He paused. What he supplied himself was the knowledge of what to say, the mother, the specific architecture of her fear. He drew on the pipe again slowly. "That is the part that required knowing her. That is the part that required 30 years. The train appeared in the distance, its lamp cutting through the mist. "Do you know," I said, "I think that's what troubled me most about him from the beginning. He was so familiar with her. Not warmly, not genuinely, but with the ease of a man who has catalogued a person very thoroughly." "Yes," said Holmes. "That is well put. E. Watson." We boarded the train, found our compartment. The whistle sounded and the platform began to move away. The lights of the small station retreating into the dark and the mist until they were gone. Holmes leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes, not sleeping I knew, but doing that thing he did occasionally when a case was resolved, where he simply allowed his mind to go quiet for a moment, to stop running, to let the finished work settle. I watched the dark countryside move past the window. After a while, perhaps 20 minutes outside London, the city beginning to announce itself in the gradual warming of the sky, Holmes spoke without opening his eyes. "The cruelest crimes," he said quietly, "are those committed against the mind." I looked at him. His face was still, composed entirely itself. "Because the damage," he continued, "is not always visible. It does not bleed. It does not break cleanly. It sits inside the person it was done to, and it whispers." He paused on the word, and I felt the weight he gave it, long after the source of the whispers has been removed. He was quiet for a moment. "She will be all right. I meant that. But she will hear those voices in her memory for some time yet. Not from the walls, from herself. And that, Watson, is the final cruelty of what he did, that the instrument once used does not immediately fall silent." I said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the lights of London's outer reaches were beginning to appear, scattered at first, then thickening. "You stopped it," I said. "We stopped it," Holmes said, considerably later than I should have. He opened his eyes, or looked at the ceiling of the compartment. I stood in my room that first night and heard my own name from inside the wall, and stood there confused for a full minute, Watson. A full minute. A brief, self-deprecating compression of his mouth. "It is not my finest hour." "You worked it out," I said. "Eventually," he said, with the precision of a man who finds the word eventually faintly unsatisfying. I smiled, despite myself. "Holmes," I said, "you are occasionally permitted to be human." He looked at me with an expression that was dry and warm in equal measure and said nothing, which was, from Holmes, a form of agreement. I wrote up the case that winter in the usual way, at my desk, late evenings, the fire going well. Holmes in his chair across the room, engaged in whatever chain of thought or experiment currently held him. I wrote it carefully, because I wanted to do justice to Vivian Ashworth, who had come to us pale and shaking on a grey November morning, and had borne herself, throughout the whole strange and difficult business, with a quiet courage that I found, and find even now, setting it down again, genuinely admirable. I gave the manuscript to Holmes when I had finished, as I occasionally did, and watched him read it with the same expression he brought to everything. Thoughtful, critical, faintly proprietary. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "You've made me seem uncertain," he said. "You were uncertain," I said. A pause. "Yes," he said, "I was." He picked up his violin. "Leave it as it is?" He played that evening, something slow and unstructured, not quite a melody, and the kind of playing that is less performance than thought made audible. And I sat by the fire with my pipe and listened to it. And outside the windows of Baker Street, the London fog pressed up against the glass, in its usual patient, impenetrable way. And inside the sitting room, the lamplight was warm and steady, and the shadows were entirely, perfectly silent.